Well, hello, friends, and thank you for joining with me as we continue our look at Second Peter. We've been in chapter 3 for a couple of weeks now, and we're at verse 8. And it's interesting. Last week I began talking about Peter's statement about reminding us and about being not forgetful and to recall things. And I went into quite a bit of detail about that. And it's kind of interesting because here we are in verse 8, where once again, Peter is reiterating this important concept about not forgetting essential things. And he said, do not forget this. This one thing, he says, dear friends, with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. And it's interesting to me because I think when I first read that, probably the first several times I read it, I didn't really give that a great deal of thought. I thought of time in the concept of being kind of an absolute. And when you begin to realize that time is not an absolute, time is something that God created, and there will be a time when God creates a new heaven and earth where there will be no time at all. So that it's kind of hardwired in our mind to think in time frames. I mean, I like watches. I mean, I always keep track of the time, how long it's going to take me to do this. In fact, I even have a timer that tells me how long I can keep talking. And sometimes I actually pay attention to it. But the whole point is that time is really this thing that God created along with everything else. In fact, when he talks in Genesis about creating the star, the moon, the sun, the planets, and so forth, he said he gave those to us so that we could measure time. And it's interesting, that's still how we measure time. If you think about it, the rotation of the planets, the Earth around the sun, the moon, and so forth and so on. We measure time by these orbits that take place around us, and even the placement of various stars in the sky. It's to enable us to measure time. But I think for different reasons that we often think. I mean, we can ask the question, am I going to be in time? Am I going to be in the right place at the right time? But I think more importantly, God wants us to realize that we have limited time, that our life is a temporary thing here upon this planet, and that time will expire. We're going to, quote, run out of time. And that's true of everything in our life. When I was younger, you kind of don't think about not being here on the planet Earth with everybody else that you know. Death was more of an abstract. Not that it was completely devoid of my life, but it was kind of an abstract. I remember having one acquaintance who his parents were killed in a plane crash, which was very tragic, but suddenly he and his sister inherited all of these resources, and here he was, a guy in his early or late teens. He's living in the parents' house, which had a pool, and he was living large and having a good time, had parties all the time. And then one night he was sitting around drinking beer, which he wasn't legally old enough to do. He tripped, hit his head on the side of the pool, rolled into the pool, and drowned. And I remember thinking to myself how not only how tragic and shocking that was, but it was really interesting, the kind of calculation, the math I started doing in my mind. And it's the idea that you never want to be drinking by yourself around someplace where you can get in trouble. So that makes sure you always have somebody who's with you who can make sure that you don't do anything stupid. Well, I found out that that wasn't an assurance, especially if they were drinking also. But the whole point is that it didn't really strike me that it's just a matter of time. Not until the Lord began to work on my heart before I got saved. And I remember how the Lord just began to really press in on me, because I was pretty basically committed to this pathway of Eastern mysticism, and I was doing yoga exercises, and I was meditating and reading the Bhagavad Gita and trying to understand it, listening to the messages of my guru and all the rest of that nonsense. And it really struck me one day that, see, the goal was to reach nirvana, reach bliss consciousness. That if we meditated long enough, there would come a point where we would ascend beyond just the limits of our own body and mind, and we would astrally project ourselves into the universe, and we would have this oneness with the great mind out there in the universe, blah, blah, blah. And I remember it suddenly struck me, what happens if I die before reaching bliss consciousness? And I thought, what the answer was in Hinduism? You just go back as some other form and start all over again. And In fact, that's kind of the entire Mandela that you go through for all of eternity. I thought, that is really a depressing thought. I used to find comfort in the idea of reincarnation. Now I find that reincarnation is just another version of hell. And I want to break free from these things. I don't want to have to be perpetually bound to them. Well, you know, it's interesting because one of the things that Peter is emphasizing here is he said that time is something that God created, and time is something that God can shrink, and time is something God can stretch, and time is also something that eventually God will remove completely. And that the goal and the opposite of time is eternity. Eternity is not, like the Amazing Grace says, when we've been there for 10,000 years, bright shining like the sun. Well, we're not going to be there for 10,000 years because there's not going to be any clocks. There's not going to be calendars. And so we live in this kind of a really bifurcated, truncated reality as Christians, because on one hand, we are locked in time. We are the victims of time. We can't escape time, and time eventually will kill us because it will run out. But on the other hand, there's eternity, which is timelessness, which is a concept that I can't really conceive because I've never lived fully in eternity. I've had glimpses of it, experiences of it, but I've never really become encompassed in eternity. But that becomes the hope, where you go to a place where there's no more tears, as John said in Revelation, no more weeping, no more sorrow, no more death, no more pain, no more loss, no more defeats and failures. But it is done, as Revelation 16 says. It's finished, it's completed, it's met its nexus. Even as Jesus said on the cross, it is finished. And it's not finished the fact that it's run out and it's over, and then you simply just kind of deteriorate into nothingness. It's this journey is over, and immediately we find ourselves in the presence of the God of the universe. And if you're a believer, it means that you're going to be with him for all of eternity and living and reigning with him. And how God measures eternity has to be some other dynamic. Because one of the things we know about, at least the physicists tell us, is that there are multiple dimensions of reality beyond our ability to conceive. Now, how they come up with that, I can't tell you, but it's been kind of a conclusion of physicists around the world for quite some time, that there's got to be multiple dimensions, someplace between 3 and 27 different dimensions of reality. Now, you're saying, well, what difference does that make to me? Well, it's because I live in this limited dimensions, this 4-dimensional world of time, space, and matter, and so forth. And I don't know anything outside of that. That's my experience. When Paul says he was caught into the third heaven, he says, I saw things that were not lawful for me to repeat. And I've thought about that a lot. I don't think it's so much the idea of he was breaking a rule if he told us, because we have places where we are told very clearly. But it's not something that we can find a vocabulary for. It's not something that's permissible because we don't have the language that would correctly describe it. It's the reason we're told not to make an image of God, because it wouldn't be truly representative of God. And that's why he tells us, when you talk about eternity, we can never truly represent what it is, because we will always have to compare it to what we know. And that remains the thing that we know by revelation, but not by experience. So these things, I don't mean to be horribly complicated about this, but I think that what happens is we somehow lose sight, and we think that the physical, material world we're in is reality and eternity is not. We call it pie in the sky, and then sweet by and by, floating on clouds with wings and playing harps, and all these kind of illusions that are put out there by people, these ideas. But the simple fact is that is more real than what we know. Why? Because what we know here will end. But what we'll know in eternity will never end. What we know here on earth will be destroyed and collapsed. We talked about creation, control, and collapse. And it's all going to collapse. But heaven is eternal. And those who are there will never experience any of those kinds of things. And what he's saying to us is, don't forget that, because sometimes you become so time-based that you're not eternally based. You become earthbound in your thinking, and you measure every situation in your life by how much time it takes or how much time it robs you. And we think constantly, and my bank accounts, my investments, my retirement, it's all how will it grow over time this, time that. And not that those are unimportant, because they're part of negotiating and managing the dynamics of this materialistic world, which we have to, as Jesus said, occupy till he comes. But the whole point is that that's not my hope, and that's not what I'm pointing to. It reminds me of a friend of mine who was, when he was still in the business world, was making a significant amount of money, and he decided that he would tithe on his money, and the more he tithed, the more he wanted to give. In fact, he said, I came to a point where I had so much extra income that rather than investing it as my accountant was telling me to do, I wanted to begin to invest it in ministry, because he says, I want my money to go into eternity. I want to meet my investments in eternity. I don't want them just to be here on the earth. And I thought to myself, how many people really become that committed? And I think it's played out in his life. I've seen God, not that he is without struggles and trials, but God has used him powerfully. And it's kind of exciting to watch. For me, it's like your kid doing really well. You just want him to, your kid makes it in the major leagues. You want him to be successful. But I see that spiritual dynamic where somebody wants to become a fully devoted follower. And if you're going to be that, you have to realize that your investment is in eternity, not simply in time, of which I'm out of. So we'll pick up the conversation tomorrow. Blessings.